All right, welcome to another episode of Mr. K is Wrong, where I look at the Facebook posts of somebody I used to know that I call Mr. K, and I debunk his right wing bullcrap. So, Mr. K has once again demonstrated why you just can't trust right wing ideology. Not only does Mr. K support a wannabe dictator here in the United States, but he's also supporting them sometimes overseas, apparently. So in this case, he shared a meme that is favorably quoting El Salvadoran President Bukele. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be a little bit fair minded. You might say, well, even a dictator can be right sometimes. And you know what? That is true. You got me on that one. The broken clock rule is a thing. However, that is not the case here. So let's get into the right wing meme, shall we? It goes like this, and I'm quoting now: El Salvador President Bukele calls out America. Impeach the corrupt judges, it quotes him as saying. And the meme continues: after the killer of Iriana Zarutska was ruled incompetent to stand trial for murder, El Salvador's president says the U.S. needs to do what he did: remove activist judges. He's right. Crime explodes when judges protect criminals instead of victims. End quote. And that's the end of the meme. So, why is the meme wrong? Well, let me get into that. The meme's core claim is actually fundamentally misleading. All right? It's it's a dog shit meme basically. And here's why. The meme says crime rises because judges protect criminals instead of victims. End quote. Well, that's not how the US legal system works, at least not typically. Plus, I mean, when it comes to protecting criminals instead of victims, you have to kind of look at what Trump has been doing. For example, Trump is obsessed with drug traffickers, right? Well, what do you know? He pardoned the former president of Honduras who trafficked in hundreds of tons of cocaine and was actually convicted for it. But because Trump was bribed, he received probably like a certain amount of money. Well, he pardoned that former uh, president of Honduras, or whatever his official title was. So there you go. You've got one example instantly of one of the biggest examples of hypocrisy ever. Somebody who's absolutely obsessed with drug trafficking into the United States, pardoning somebody who was drug trafficking hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. And it's enough to make you pull your hair out that the media is not talking about that like a lot more. I know we've got a lot of things going on in the world, but that's kind of a big deal. That's like basically textbook definition hypocrisy, and just bizarre hypocrisy on top of that. But anyway, getting into how the U.S. legal system works, let's take a look at this claim about judges protecting criminals. Judges ruling someone incompetent to stand trial is more about mental fitness, not letting someone go free. So that hasn't really happened yet in this case, at least as far as I'm aware of. In those cases, defendants are usually committed to psychiatric treatment, not fully released. So, just to be clear on that, psychiatric hospital type settings are still a thing. And if you look into the history of crime, Ed Gein was sentenced to a psychiatric type of prison. So it's not like this is something that is totally mysterious as a punishment slash treatment for people who are mentally ill. So the premise already distorts reality. It reframes a legal safeguard as protecting criminals, which is inaccurate. And then you've got Nayib Bukele, who is not a neutral authority on justice. And let me get into that. He is a dictator. Bukele is often praised online for being tough on crime, but that comes with some serious documented abuses. And that's human rights groups who report mass arbitrary arrests, the use of torture, deaths in custody, and disappearances during his crackdown. Over 85,000 people have been detained, including minors, with thousands later found to be innocent. Hundreds have died in prison custody. Critics, journalists, and activists have been arrested under questionable charges, raising authoritarian concerns, but not a concern that Mr. K addresses in this meme. So keep in mind, this is another example of the right wingers who really want to boil politics down to bumper sticker type slogans, when in this case, it's totally overlooking the authoritarian concerns about the person that the meme is quoting. So, this is not just being tough on crime, it's widely described as systematic human rights violations. A little bit worse than just a common criminal, or even just like a one off murderer in some ways. This is somebody who is abusing people on a mass scale. So you've also got the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case that directly contradicts the meme. So let me get into that a little bit. I know right wingers are like, why are people so obsessed with Kilmar Abrego Garcia? Well, that's a little bit ironic because it's actually the Trump administration that was so obsessed with the man. So the meme frames Bukele as defending justice, but one of the most prominent real cases shows the exact opposite. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was wrongfully deported despite a court order protecting him. He was never charged or convicted of any crime. He was publicly labeled a terrorist and a gangster without evidence. He was imprisoned in El Salvador's mega prison. Reports describe beatings, torture, starvation, and abuse. And even after U.S. courts ordered action to free him, both Bukele and Trump officials refused to fix the situation until there was enough public pressure that they finally buckled. And in my opinion, surprisingly, I thought they were just going to leave him, stuck over there. But it took the the action of a lot of people out there in the public and certain prominent U.S. politicians to make sure that there would be some actual rectification in this case. And this whole story, this simple story of what one person's uh, you know the attacks against him, it really undercuts the meme's narrative completely. The same leaders claiming to defend victims were involved in jailing a man without charges or due process, and of course, just lying about him. So you've got libelous claims on top of that, or defamation. Of a lot of lies were being told about the man, in addition to the abuse that they put him through. And let's look at Donald Trump and documented wrongdoing once we're talking about crime. Trump is not a credible messenger on law and order either. In addition to the illegal Iran war that has been waged without congressional approval, and all of the human rights abuses that are going on with ICE and whatnot, you've got the fact that Trump has been convicted of felony charges. If you look at the 2024 hush money case, he faced multiple additional criminal cases like election interference, classified documents, etc. Of course, Merrick Garland dropped the ball on that, and so did what's his name, the I can't remember his name, but they they failed to successfully prosecute Trump for that because they were just totally failing. But nevertheless, he was there was definitely a lot of evidence that Trump was guilty of a lot of those things, and his administration illegally deported people like Abrego Garcia in violation of court orders, and they've deported migrants to foreign prisons with little or no evidence of criminal activity, and so on and so forth. So there are also broader human rights concerns tied to his policies, including family separation and due process violations, which are widely documented, though not in a lot of the press coverage. They don't often enough go into the specifics, so you have to like dig deeper behind the scenes or look to a lot of alternative news sources, which of course might get you pegged as a conspiracy theorist anytime you do that. And the meme ignores you know a crime or an act of violence that might be committed on the right. you know uh, when it comes to right wing crime, Trump will not be posting memes about that, and neither will his followers. So the claim that crime is driven by lenient judges or protected criminals leaves out a huge part of reality. For one thing, as I said already, Trump is protecting criminals. He pardoned the January 6th criminals, for example, and many high profile crimes in the US are committed by native born citizens, not immigrants. Keep that in mind. And right wing extremism has been identified by US agencies as a major domestic terrorism threat. The general consensus has been across the FBI and DHS reporting, although Trump is, of course, working to no longer do those kind of studies. But before Trump ever got into the White House, that was something that the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security was actually concerned about, at least in their official documents. And you've got political violence tied to MAGA ideology that includes events like the January 6th Capitol attack. And then, of course, if you look behind the scenes there, a lot of those people who were pardoned would go on to commit additional crimes. And there's a good website for that if you want to learn some of those stories. It's called Right Wing Watch. It's similar to Right Wing Watch, only they distinguish themselves by putting Reich instead of right wing. So they go into like the molestation type scandals of people on the right, like Republicans or whatever, the same types who will blame those sorts of crimes on anybody in the LGBTQ community, for example. So anyway, these types of criminals they're minimized if they're even acknowledged at all, or reframed in the same you know, circles sharing memes like this as just being like, oh, they're random one off crimes. Whereas if somebody who commits a crime gets memed by Trump or somebody else like that, then they'll make it seem like everyone in that group is a part of that crime. Like if an immigrant commits a violent crime, then all of the immigrants are responsible for it. And then they'll argue like, well, that person shouldn't have been here in the first place. Well, you could say the same thing about any criminal, right? Like you could say Ted Bundy should not have been he should not have been born. So you can make a pro-abortion argument on that, really, if you want. Like you could do all sorts of little mental gymnastics to make policy proclamations based on criminals. Like you could say, well, if George W. Bush had been deported, he could not have waged the Iraq War. Technically, it might even be correct. Um, sure, but it wasn't going to happen, and there was no way to know for sure, for absolute sure, that he was going to do something like that. You could have guessed, maybe, but you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Like if you have the statistics in front of you, you can see that immigrants tend to actually commit fewer crimes than native born citizens. But that, of course, doesn't mean that all native born citizens are criminals, you know? So sometimes these arguments, it should really be based on more of what the individual case is rather than, making it into something that basically harms the entire group, that lumps everybody from that entire designated group into that one person's crime. You know what I mean? So I don't like the argument that, oh, that person shouldn't have been here because, well, every time somebody commits a crime, they should not have been there committing that crime. It's like and it sounds like an intelligent argument to a lot of ordinary people out there. They think, oh, yeah, that's true. He shouldn't have been there. And, but, the problem is there are plenty of immigrants who even are undocumented and who don't commit violent crimes. So it's essentially like a non sequitur claim. When you really think about it, it's like sort of a no duh moment, but at the same time, it's kind of a stupid claim because when it comes to individual criminals, if they have a criminal record, especially, well, then that might be a failure of not necessarily the immigration system, but society as a whole for helping to craft such criminals. And that's not because judges somewhere are just weak on crime. It's because we have sort of an antisocial society, an antisocial economy on a global scale that kind of encourages people to see each other as if they are all enemies and whatnot. Therefore, it makes it easier for people who are like psychopaths or otherwise antisocial, makes it easier for them to rationalize committing crimes against other people because they see other people as nothing but competitors. They see them as sort of like abstract entities. And when it comes to, crimes that are committed based on racism or sexist attitudes or whatever like that, well, that's something that you could also say is happening because they have a perception of that group and they see that one victim as representative of that group. So, racism is a lot easier to have happen in a society that has a lot of what is called stratification. And when there's class distinction and all sorts of things like that, we've got sort of a a class stratification built into the system. So we're kind of encouraged to categorize certain people as lesser or more than other people. We put them in a different ideological categories, and that makes it easier for societal violence to happen. Now, that's not to say that this is totally avoidable in every instance, because I mean, it's sort of deeply ingrained in like the culture and the educational system to view other people as being, you know, in a different category in some way. So there's no perfect solution to this problem, but you have to be aware of it if you want to take steps toward a solution. And with memes like this, well, we see the hazards here because this meme is just trying to add other layers on top of the ideological prison that we're already in when it comes to overly classifying people and categorizing them. And when it comes to this meme, it feeds into the selective outrage and the racial I was gonna say racial framing. It's part of the you know it's just a disgusting thing. That it's part of the it's part of what the meme doesn't say out loud, but it's important. There's a lot of cases involving immigrants or non-white suspects who get amplified heavily by right wingers. Meanwhile, crimes by white or right wing perpetrators are often downplayed, ignored, or reframed as isolated incidents. And this creates a distorted perception. It makes crime seem like an outsider problem when crime patterns are far more complex. And it makes it seem like it's just something that happens because liberals exist or something like that, or whatever these right wingers want to say. You know, is the main source, like lenient judges, activist judges, or something like that. When in reality, like um, sometimes I there's a controversial thing, but I'm going to say it. Sometimes a person could even commit a violent crime and not be a repeat offender. Sometimes you have to maybe consider giving somebody an extra chance. And for example, I just not that long ago did an episode on the folk musician Leadbelly. Now, he had spent time in prison and he was given another chance or two, you know? And what's interesting about him is he became one of the all time most influential folk musicians. And, if society didn't give him another chance, well, he wouldn't have been influential and, that sort of thing. That's just one example. And, there are other examples. And if you say something like that, some people are going to be like, oh, no, you're being soft on crime. You're being a weak liberal activist or whatever. But the problem is, do you always, you know, lock somebody up and throw away the key? Or do you sometimes make an exception to that? And when it comes to right wingers, well, we know they make exceptions to that already. And, people in power, they make exceptions to that when it comes to the rich and the well connected, like the Epstein class, as they are sometimes called nowadays. When it comes to like millionaires and billionaires and war profiteers, they can participate in violence as much as they want. They can steal things, they can pollute the environment, all sorts of stuff like that. That's not a big deal. In fact, we don't often hear about those stories even. But really, that's an example of them having a double standard. So there's actually a bigger issue in some ways when it comes to the statement about the need to remove activist judges. So, what does that mean? It's actually, in some ways, the most dangerous part of the meme because it's calling to remove judges who rule against uh, right wing ideology in some respects. So, it's an attack on judicial independence and a step toward authoritarian control of courts. So Bukele has already moved in that direction by consolidating power over El Salvador's judiciary, and people warn that this is part of a broader erosion of democracy. So the meme falls apart on multiple levels. It misrepresents how courts work. It relies on leaders with documented human rights abuses and just sweeps all those aside like they don't matter. It ignores cases where those same leaders violated due process, and it selectively frames crime to fit a political narrative. And most importantly, it promotes weakening the rule of law while claiming to defend it. So that's about it for this episode. I feel like I've been yakking for a little while now, and let me know what you think. And feel free to like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, have a good day.